Let's begin. Gently, with a journey through time, settle in, take a breath. You're safe, warm, and nowhere near the 14th century. That's a relief. Because tonight we're opening the creaky, rusted gates of medieval Europe, a world not known for comfort, logic, or dental care. In this particular corner of bedtime history, we won't talk about kings or crusades or castles glowing in the moonlight. No, we're heading to the side alley, the mud-caked servants' entrance, the drafty back rooms. This is the story of the worst jobs you could possibly have in the Middle Ages, a time when career path usually meant try not to die before lunch. Now, the Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were an era full of contradictions. Beautiful cathedrals and brutal executions, knights in shining armour, and peasants with no shoes. It was a time when diseases had names like the Black Death, and treatment often included just warm pigeon droppings. Medical school was optional. Actually, shoes were optional. Soap was suspicious, and if you were unlucky, which you usually were, you ended up with a job that didn't just stink metaphorically, it literally smelled like death, rot, urine, or all three. You might imagine that in medieval times people only did jobs like knight, or monk, or wandering bard with a lute. But no, there were dozens of everyday roles that kept medieval society running, quietly, painfully, and usually barefoot. And while some were just dull or difficult, others were downright gruesome, bloody dangerous, humiliating, or simply revolting. And yet, these jobs were vital. Without the spit boy, the knight didn't eat. Without the body collector, the plague would spread even faster. And without the tanner, well, everyone would be naked and cold, which is not a great combo in medieval England. It's easy to laugh now, safely tucked into a clean bed with access to indoor plumbing and, antibiotics. But for the average person in 1347, career advancement often meant not being trampled by a mule. These jobs weren't rare, they were common enough that whole communities were built around people cleaning hides with pigeon poop, or hauling leeches from swamps with their bare legs. You'll meet those people tonight, slowly, softly, and probably while you're drifting off to sleep, which is honestly the ideal way to experience medieval labour conditions, unconscious and from a distance. Each of the 12 parts you'll hear in this series will explore one of these deeply unpleasant professions. Some are physically exhausting, some are emotionally damaging, some are just gross in a way that feels impressive, even by historical standards. We'll talk about how they worked, what made them dangerous, and why anyone at all, would agree to do them. Most of the time the answer is simple: they had no choice. If you were born into a certain village, with a certain name, or with certain debts to pay, then congratulations, your job was waiting. And no, it did not come with dental insurance, or shoes. But don't worry, this won't be a loud or fast-paced lecture. It's a slow walk through grimy history, delivered softly, carefully, like a bedtime story with more urine buckets. Think of it as a guided tour through the careers your ancestors probably prayed to avoid. We'll go one job at a time, with each section lasting about 10 minutes. Long enough to settle into, but not so long you'll be stuck awake imagining yourself scrubbing armour with vinegar and sand. So close your eyes if you'd like, let your breathing slow, and picture a distant world. Candlelight flickers on stone walls, somewhere a bell tolls in the fog, and a man trudges past dragging a wheelbarrow full of suspiciously lumpy burlap sacks. You don't need to help him, just let him pass. He has a job to do. You, on the other hand, have only one task tonight: to rest, while we do all the hard, boring, disgusting work for you. And now, our first stop. A cold pond, a pair of bare legs, and dozens of hungry little bloodsuckers waiting in the mud. Sweet dreams. Let's meet the leech collector. Our story tonight begins not with a sword or crown, but with a pair of trembling bare legs, stepping slowly into a freezing, muddy pond. The water is dark, the morning is foggy, and the job ahead is not one of glory. It is one of stillness, pain, and patience. The job, leech collector. One of the most quietly horrifying ways to earn a living in medieval times, and yet entirely necessary. Because in the Middle Ages, blood was the answer to almost every question. You see, Medieval medicine was based on the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, it meant your humours were out of balance. Too hot, too wet, too melancholic. Not a problem. The solution was often simple. Remove some blood. Naturally. Enter the humble leech. Doctors loved leeches. They were seen as precise little tools, organic syringes with teeth. And while they didn't understand how diseases actually worked, they were very confident that letting a few ounces of blood out of your body would fix nearly anything. Fever, leech, headache, leech, swollen foot. Why not throw a few on there? But to treat patients, someone had to collect the leeches, and that job went to the poor, often women, who were desperate enough to walk into still stagnant water and let the creatures attach to their skin. This wasn't a quick task. A good leech collector had to stand still, sometimes for hours, in waist-deep water. The colder the better, that's where the leeches like to hide. They'd cling to the legs, ankles and thighs of the collector, biting through skin with tiny saw-like jaws. Their saliva numbed the area and thinned the blood, which meant you often didn't feel the bite, until you saw the bright red trickle. Each leech would drink about a teaspoon of blood. That doesn't sound like much, until you realise they often collected dozens, even hundreds in one day. Too many bites could lead to dizziness, fatigue, fainting, or infection. But the real danger wasn't just blood loss. Leeches, as it turns out, are not clean little creatures. They were often host to blood-borne diseases, things like hepatitis or even malaria. If you were unlucky, you might walk out of the pond with more than just a bucket of wiggling parasites. You might walk out with a fever, or not walk out at all. Leech collectors didn't get fame or thanks. They didn't work for doctors directly. They sold their squirming cargo at markets or to apothecaries. The leeches were stored in jars or animal bladders, carefully sealed and sold by the dozen. Some collectors used livestock as bait instead of their own legs, but that required resources. Most simply stood in the mud, often barefoot, and let nature do its very worst. The job was seasonal too. In warmer months, leeches were easier to find. In winter, the ponds froze, and so did the work. There were stories of leech collectors who kept warm by wrapping their arms around sheep or lighting tiny fires near the banks, but mostly they just endured the cold. Quietly. Because the quieter they were, the more leeches came. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't safe, it wasn't even particularly profitable. But it was a job, one that kept doctors supplied, patients treated and blood flowing, in more ways than one. Tonight, as you lie in your bed, think for a moment about that still pond cloaked in morning mist. The only sound is the occasional ripple of water, and perhaps the faint splash of a jar being filled. A figure stands in the distance, unmoving, waiting, cold. She'll return home with bruises and bleeding shins, but also with enough leeches to feed her family for a few more days. So rest easy, knowing you'll never need to wade into a swamp to harvest your medicine. Your legs are warm, your blood is safe, and the leeches are far, far away. In the next chapter, though, you may not be so lucky, because we're taking to the road, and we're not going alone. Our next job involves something much bigger, hairier, and considerably angrier than a leech. In part 3, we'll meet the man who walked across medieval Europe, with a bear on a leash. Let us walk now, slowly, down a muddy country road. The fog clings to the treetops like a blanket, and the only sound you hear, besides the occasional crow, is the soft crunch of boots over wet gravel. But you're not alone on this path. Just ahead of you is a figure cloaked in rough woolen leather. A worn chain hangs from his hand, and at the end of that chain is a bear. Yes, a bear. Welcome to the world of the bear leader, a man tasked with escorting one of nature's most unpredictable beasts across the medieval countryside. His job? Dangerous. His company? Reluctant. And his destination? Likely a public square where the crowd waits eagerly for the cruel entertainment of bear baiting. A gruesome spectacle where the bear is pitted against dogs for the pleasure of nobles and commoners alike. But before the cheering, before the fighting, before the coin is thrown and the trumpets sound, there is the long, quiet journey. And that journey is where the bear leader earns his keep. The bear may be muzzled, it may be chained, but it is still a bear, a creature of bone-crushing strength and deep ancient instincts. One moment of hesitation from the handler and the consequences could be fatal. Imagine walking through narrow alleyways past barking dogs, screaming children, and flapping clotheslines, with 600 pounds of muscle and teeth behind you, and not just once, again and again from town to town for weeks at a time. To keep the bear calm, the leader had to learn its rhythms. He'd feed it, speak to it softly, keep it warm when nights grew cold. A relationship formed, a thin, fragile cord of trust that could snap at any time. Some bears grew used to the travel. Others never did. They growled at shadows, yanked at chains, and sometimes they broke free. There are tales, of course, whispered ones, of bear leaders who vanished on the road, of townsfolk who awoke to find paw prints by the riverbank, of warning bells ringing through villages as handlers tried to regain control of a panicked beast. These weren't myths. They were part of the job. But the bear leader also had to worry about people, not just the animal. Highwaymen saw a man walking alone with a bear and imagined coin. Drunks would provoke the animal for sport. Nobles might demand a private show, and if the bear misbehaved, well, the leader took the punishment. And yet, this job was strangely coveted by some. It meant travel, adventure, a chance to earn a reputation, and perhaps even make a living. Not all medieval work involved filth or war, some involved performance, but make no mistake, this was not a gentle life. The bear itself was often caught young, ripped from its den in the wild and trained harshly. It learned to dance on command, to sit, to obey the tug of the chain. Some bear leaders filed down the teeth, others starved them slightly to keep them sluggish. The cruelty was normalized. For some, the bear was not a creature at all. It was property, a thing to be paraded. But the more the leader spent time with his bear, the more he knew. This animal was no fool. It remembered. It waited. At night they would sleep close by, separated by only a cage or chain. Some claimed the bear snored. Others said it cried. But mostly it was silent, watching. As you drift towards sleep now, picture that silent night on the road. A fire crackles low. The bear breathes slowly. The man, exhausted, leans against a tree, one eye always open. Because trust only goes so far when danger wears fur. The next time you see a picture of a medieval market, with its juggler and its fool, remember the man in the shadows. The one with the rope burns on his hands. The one whose travelling companion could end him with a single blow, yet walked beside him mile after mile. So sleep, traveller. Sleep gently, knowing you need not keep one eye open tonight. There are no bears at your door, no chains dragging through your hallway, and the fog on the road is only a dream. In Part 4, we trade fur for feasts, and meet a person whose life depended on every bite of royal food they swallowed. Up next, the food taster. The castle is quiet in the early morning hours. A chill creeps across the stone floors, and torchlight dances gently along the heavy tapestries. In the great hall, long wooden tables sit ready for the feast to come. Silver platters glint faintly, already polished, already waiting. Servants whisper as they move through the corridors. A heavy day lies ahead, and among them one figure walks slowly, purposefully. His duty is not to serve wine or to carry dishes. His job is far more perilous. He is the food taster. In the medieval world, power came with many threats. Kings, queens, and noble lords dined in splendour, but every bite they took, every sip of spiced wine carried the risk of death. Assassination by poison was a quiet form of betrayal, and in an era of shifting alliances and fragile loyalties it was not uncommon. Which is why the royal court employed a very specific kind of servant, someone whose sole task was to eat first. Imagine now the food taster stepping into the royal banquet hall. The chamber is grand, filled with the smell of roasted meat, herbs, and warm bread. Minstrels tune their lutes in the corner. Outside, the crowd gathers to glimpse the nobles as they feast. But for the food taster, there is little joy in the pageantry. He kneels beside the table, head bowed. The servants place each dish before him, not to serve, but to test. A slice of lamb, a spoonful of soup, a piece of fruit. He tastes it all, slowly, carefully, and then he waits. There is no glamour in his role, no applause, no gratitude, only silence and the steady beat of his own heart. The food taster's life was one of constant uncertainty. Any dish could be the last, and the poisons of the medieval world, they were not swift, not always. Some caused slow cramping, fever, blurred vision. Others took hours to take hold. A clever poisoner might use just enough to cause illness, to test how far suspicion could be pushed. The taster, therefore, had to be familiar with symptoms, with timing, with his own body's signals. Even something as simple as feeling faint after a meal could send waves of panic through the court. The job didn't end with food alone. In some royal courts, such as the notorious court of King Henry VIII, even the king's clothing was tested. Garments were worn by others first, to ensure no toxic powder had been hidden in the seams. Bed linens were kissed, wine was sampled, goblets examined. The taster was just one of many human shields placed between royalty and the threat of death. But unlike the knights on the battlefield or the guards at the gate, this shield was quiet, subtle, and ever-present. And there was more to it than danger. There was discomfort. A taster might be required to kneel for hours, attending lavish feasts while trying not to draw attention. Sometimes he would feel ill, not from poison, but from overeating. The pressure to perform was constant. One mistake could mean disaster, not just for him, but for the crown. Not all food tasters were volunteers. Some were selected from the servant class. Others were prisoners given the role as a path to pardon. In rare cases, tasters earned a trust and rose in court favour. But many were simply forgotten. Nameless protectors who saved lives one meal at a time. Think of that now, as you relax further. A slow fire crackles in the castle's kitchen. The taster wipes his mouth, exhales quietly, and steps aside. Another meal has passed. The king lives, and so does he, for now. His presence was invisible, but vital. He knew the kitchens. He understood herbs, meat, oils. He knew how a poisoned tongue might swell, how a bitter almond smell might betray arsenic. And he bore the weight of this knowledge every day, in silence. So the next time you dream of royal banquets and gilded goblets, remember the figure in the background. The one kneeling by the fire, eyes wary, stomach churning, not from hunger, but from fear. Let the image soften now. The feast is over. The hall is dim again. The nobles retire to their chambers, and the taster, still alive, returns to his small quarters in the servants' wing. The threat is over for tonight. In the next chapter, we follow another servant, but this one must carry armour into battle, sometimes unarmed, through smoke and blood. Up next, the arming squire. A rooster crows in the faint grey light of morning. The sky is still bruised with the fading tones of night. Within the wooden walls of a castle keep the world is already stirring. Fires are stoked, horses begin to neigh, and armour clinks in distant corridors. But in one small chamber a boy, no more than 14, rubs sleep from his eyes. His day begins earlier than most, and it ends much later. He is an arming squire. To become a knight in the medieval world was a long, brutal process. Glory in battle came at a cost, and no boy was simply handed a sword. First, he had to serve, year after year, as the shadow of a man greater than himself. The arming squire was that shadow, and his job was far more dangerous than it seemed. The arming squire was responsible for preparing a knight for battle, not simply polishing armour or fetching weapons, but dressing him head to toe, tightening straps, buckling greaves, adjusting the mail hauberk with careful precision. If one piece was out of place, the knight could fall in combat. So the boy worked in silence, often on his knees, learning the rituals of war one steel plate at a time. But the most perilous moments were not in the armoury. They came when the horn of battle sounded, when the field erupted in chaos, when men screamed and banners fell, and the squire was called not to hide, but to run directly into danger. During the fray, if a knight was thrown from his horse, or injured, or trapped beneath his armour, it was the squire's duty to reach him, to lift, drag, or defend. Sometimes the knight had lost his sword. Sometimes he had lost consciousness, and the squire, unarmed, barely trained, had to reach him before the enemy did. Imagine that now, the battlefield before you. Smoke drifts like mist across the trampled grass. Horses panic, men fall, the clang of weapons echoes through the valley, and through it all the young squire sprints, ducking arrows, leaping over bodies, dragging a chest plate in one hand, a helmet in the other. He does not hesitate. He cannot. Those who survived learned quickly. They grew strong, nimble, clever. They memorized every knot, every clasp, every method of lacing chainmail in motion, and they learned to clean the aftermath, because after battle came the second half of their duty, cleaning the armour. Imagine kneeling beside a bloodied cuirass, sand and dried blood embedded in the steel, bits of flesh stuck in the joints. The armour had to be scoured by hand, using rough cloth, vinegar, and even urine to break down the stains and remove the scent of the rot. It was hard, filthy work, and it had to be perfect. Armour was expensive, and a knight's life might depend on it once again. This training could last for years. Some boys began as pages at age 7, learning manners, swordplay, and horsemanship. By their teens, they became squires, and only if they survived long enough, on the battlefield and in service, might they one day be knighted. Many never made it that far. Some fell in battle, others were maimed. Some simply faded into anonymity, forgotten as their masters rose to fame. They were expendable, but essential, and they carried the invisible weight of war with them. But there was pride in the role too. To be close to a knight was to glimpse power, to see courage up close, and in rare moments, a bond formed, a friendship forged in blood and loyalty. The knight relied on the squire, trusted him, gave him purpose. As you breathe slowly now, imagine the boy at the end of his day. His hands are blistered, his tunic damp with sweat and grime. He wipes a sword blade in silence, then sets it back on its rack. The castle is quiet again. The fires burn low. He stretches his aching legs and lies on the straw pallet in the corner. The sounds of the battle still echo in his mind, but for now, he sleeps. Because tomorrow, it begins again. So when you hear tales of gallant knights riding into the sunset, remember those who walked behind them, who carried their burdens, tightened their armour, and ran into battle not for glory, but because they had no other choice. In our next chapter, we visit the shadowy halls of privilege once more, but this time we meet a child not trained for battle, but punished for another's actions. Up next, the whipping boy. In a quiet stone chamber, far away from the noise of the village or the clang of weapons on the battlefield, a small boy sits on a wooden bench waiting. His clothes are plain, but clean. His hair is brushed, his posture straight, and his hands are folded in his lap. The room is silent, save for the faint ticking of a distant clock and the muffled voices beyond the thick oak door. But the boy is not here to learn his letters or recite prayers. He is here to be punished. Not for something he has done, but for something someone else has. This was the fate of the whipping boy, a job so strange, so emotionally twisted, that it's hard to imagine it ever existed. And yet, in the courts of royalty, it was once an accepted part of life. In the medieval and early modern eras, young princes, especially those of noble or royal blood, were considered far too important to be punished like ordinary children. They were divine heirs, destined to become kings. No servant, no teacher, and certainly no commoner could lay a hand on them. But, as all children do, even young royals misbehaved. They were arrogant, unruly, impulsive, and so the court devised a solution. Instead of punishing the prince directly, they punished someone he cared about. That someone was the whipping boy. Often chosen from lower nobility or a respected servant family, he was raised alongside the prince. They ate together, studied together, trained together. The hope was that a close friendship would form, and when the prince disobeyed his tutor, refused his lessons, or broke the rules, the whipping boy was beaten in his place. Imagine that for a moment. You're a child, living in a palace surrounded by gold and velvet. But every time the boy beside you throws a tantrum or talks back to the instructor, you are dragged to the centre of the room. You kneel, you are caned, or whipped, or slapped, while the prince watches. And what is worse, you must not cry, you must not show fear, because if you cry, the prince might laugh. If you wince, he might not care. But if you endure it, quietly, nobly, perhaps he will feel the sting of guilt. That, at least, was the theory. There are stories, some documented, others perhaps embellished, of deep friendships that emerged from this system. One of the most famous whipping boys was Barnaby Fitzpatrick, companion to Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII. It's said that Barnaby and Edward were close, and that Edward grew more disciplined because he could not bear to see Barnaby suffer on his behalf. Whether this bond was common or rare is unknown. Still, the emotional toll of the role must have been immense, to live each day waiting for a punishment you didn't earn, to be a moral mirror, a living deterrent. The job required not only physical endurance, but profound psychological strength, and yet, the position wasn't all pain. In many courts, whipping boys received an excellent education, often the same as the prince himself. They lived in relative comfort and safety, enjoyed influence beyond their station, and sometimes grew up to hold important positions in government or military service. A few were even knighted, but those rewards came only if they survived childhood, and if their relationship with the prince remained strong. There were no rules protecting a whipping boy from his royal companion. If the prince disliked him, or grew bored, he might dismiss him, or worse. And so every day the whipping boy had to walk the line between friend and servant, victim and companion. As you lie in bed now, letting your breath slow, imagine that strange, quiet life. A boy in a grand palace dressed in simple clothes walking beside a prince draped in silk. Always near, always watching, waiting for a tutor's scowl, a missed assignment, a flash of anger, and then the call, "Bring the boy." In the stillness of the royal classroom the punishment is given. The prince looks away. Or perhaps he doesn't. Now drift gently from this world of courts and canes. In the next chapter we trade silk for filth and comfort for stench. We descend into the world of wool, foul, heavy and soaked in human waste. Up next, the fuller and the strange smelly science of medieval cloth-making. Let us drift now from the cloistered halls of royal palaces to the stony outskirts of a medieval town. The world changes here. The walls are mottled with grime, the air is thick with the heavy scent of wet wool and something sour beneath it. Underfoot the ground is slick with mud. You hear the faint splash of bare feet in liquid, not water, something stronger, something older, something human. This is the domain of the fuller, a job that may not seem dangerous at first glance, but as we look closer, we begin to see the quiet hazards, the toxic repetition, and the nauseating endurance it demanded. In the Middle Ages, wool was life. Wool was wealth. England in particular built an empire on wool trade. Warm, water-resistant and durable, it was the fabric of choice for peasants and nobles alike. But raw wool, fresh from the sheep, was not the soft, cosy material we picture in fairy tales. It was coarse, greasy, matted with dirt, dung and lanolin. To make it usable, it had to be cleaned, softened and thickened, a process called fulling. Enter the fuller. The work began in silence. A large wooden vat was filled, not with fresh water, but with stale, human urine. It wasn't just any household waste. This was collected over days, sometimes weeks, by families, neighbours, and even entire communities. In towns across Europe, public urinals were set up not for sanitation, but for industry. Because inside urine is ammonia, and ammonia was the key to breaking down the oils and filth trapped inside wool. With bare feet, the fuller stepped into the vat. He might work alone, or with others, depending on the size of the operation. The wool was dumped in, heavy and foul-smelling, and then the stomping began. Slow, rhythmic. Over and over the fullers walked in circles, pressing the cloth into the fluid, softening the fibres, drawing out the grease. Hours passed this way. The room grew hot. The sour smell of ammonia filled their nostrils. Their feet pruned. Their skin burned. They were never far from chemical irritation, infection, or skin diseases, but this was their craft, and once the wool had been stomped thoroughly, it was rinsed in cold water, beaten with sticks, then laid out to dry. Many worked without shoes. There was no protection. Splinters, cuts, or blisters could fester quickly in the unhygienic liquid. Add to that the long hours, the repetitive strain on joints and muscles, and the chilling dampness of their workshops, and you begin to see why this job, while not dramatic like bear leading or fire spitting, wore its workers down over time, and yet it was essential. Without the fuller, no weaver could work, no tailor could cut, no noble could drape a cloak across their shoulders without smelling like the field it came from. The fuller stood at the hidden start of a long chain of fashion and trade, largely forgotten, but always necessary. There were, too, the social risks. Fullers were often seen, much like tanners or gong farmers, as unclean. Their odour followed them home. Their work marked their clothing, their skin, even their breath. In some towns, fullers were kept outside the city walls, away from the marketplaces and churches. In others, they formed tight-knit guilds, protecting their craft through secrecy and tradition. But there is a strange peace to be found in this labour. Imagine the slow steps, the squelch of wet cloth underfoot, the steady repetition of movement. In a world without machines, this was how fabric was born, not with looms or lathes, but with the human body, wading, walking, wringing. The same motions day after day, in rhythm with the seasons and the needs of the people. As the sun set over their stony workshops, the fullers would rinse their feet, hang the wool to dry, and perhaps, just perhaps, breathe clean air for a moment before it all began again the next day. Now, as your body sinks deeper into your mattress, and your breath slows to match the gentle tread of those wool workers, let the sounds of labour fade. The air is clearer here, the sky is opening. But our journey through the most unpleasant medieval trades is far from over. Next, we step even deeper into the world of filth and foulness. Up ahead lies the domain of hides and hair, of soaking pits and scraping tools. In Part 8, we meet the tanner, and learn how animal skins were transformed into leather, using tools not of elegance, but of excrement. Imagine for a moment that you're walking through a medieval town at dawn. The air is heavy with mist curling low around the cobblestones, and somewhere a cock crows drowsily in the distance. Shops are shuttered, taverns are quiet, and chimneys exhale thin threads of wood smoke into the still sky. But then you smell it. Something harsh, something sour. Your nose wrinkles. It is not firewood, nor food. It is the unmistakable stench of a tannery, carried on the morning wind. Follow that scent just beyond the edge of the town near the water where runoff flows more freely. There you find them. Wide, shallow pits dug into the ground, some bubbling, some stagnant. Rows of animal hides hang from wooden poles like ghostly sails, dripping with moisture, stiff and raw. Men bend over vats, stirring with paddles, working with a kind of quiet, repetitive intensity. Welcome to the life of the tanner, a profession so revolting, so noxious, and so physically taxing that even other medieval workers looked away. The job of a tanner was to turn raw animal skins, covered in blood, flesh, fat, and manure, into leather, one of the most valuable materials of the age. Leather was used for shoes, belts, saddles, armour, book bindings, water flasks, and countless other daily essentials. But before it could serve any purpose, the hide had to be cleaned, preserved, softened, and processed, through a series of steps so foul they might turn even the strongest stomach. First came soaking and cleaning. The tanner received the skins often straight from the butcher, still slick with gore. They were thrown into vats of lime water, a solution of calcium hydroxide that helped to loosen hair and fat. After several days soaking in the lime, during which the skins would puff up and begin to break down, the tanners pulled them out and scraped them clean with curved knives, removing fur, flesh, and anything else clinging to the surface. But lime wasn't enough. To return the hide to a workable, flexible material, the lime had to be neutralised. And here begins the most infamous step in tanning: the bait. This was a bath, often a pit in the ground, filled with animal dung, particularly dog and pigeon feces, mixed with water. It sounds like a dark joke, but it was deadly serious. The enzymes in the waste helped soften the hides and prepared them for tanning. And so, the tanner stood barefoot in the pit, wading through waste, kneading and massaging the hides by hand. This work was not only physically exhausting, but incredibly dangerous to one's health. Prolonged exposure to ammonia from the feces, combined with bacteria, put workers at risk of respiratory issues, skin diseases and infections. Cuts and blisters were common, and if not carefully treated, could become gangrenous. The smell was omnipresent. It clung to their hair, their skin, their clothing. It lingered in their homes and on their children. A tanner could not hide what he did. His craft was written on his body. Despite the unpleasantness, tanners were a necessary part of medieval society. Leather was too important to ignore, and no other material could match its durability. But socially, tanners were considered untouchables in many towns. They lived on the outskirts near rivers or drainage ditches, where runoff from their pits could be washed away. Some communities banned them from churches or civic gatherings, and many tanners passed their trade only within family lines, as few outsiders wished to take on the burden. Yet, for all the hardship, the work of the tanner had a ritualistic rhythm. There was something deeply methodical in the daily motions, scraping, soaking, folding, stirring. The steps, though filthy, were precise and required skill. Too little time in the lime, and the hair would cling stubbornly. Too much time, and the skin would rot. The dung mixture had to be stirred to just the right consistency, the hides massaged with care, the drying timed with the shifting winds and sun. In its own way, it was an art form, a grim, pungent alchemy of flesh and patience. As you imagine the world of the tanner, the sounds begin to slow. You hear the wet slap of hides in the pit, the splash of dung water underfoot, the rhythmic scrape of knife on skin. Somewhere nearby, a river murmurs, carrying away the waste. A crow caws and flaps off toward the tree line. The tanner straightens his back for a moment, wiping sweat from his brow, then bends again to his labour. Let your thoughts settle with him there, in the fog of early morning. He is not a villain, not a hero, just a man doing the work others cannot bear to see. But his job is only half done. We return now to the riverside tannery, where the morning haze has lifted and the sun casts long shadows across the pits. The air is no sweeter than before, still thick with the sour perfume of decay, lime and dung, but this is the scent of work, of progress, and strangely, of creation. Our tanner continues his methodical rhythm, lifting one freshly cleaned hide from the bait pit, his hands calloused and stained from years of this quiet, unpleasant labour. With the hide softened and scraped, the next phase begins, the actual tanning. Tanning is what gives leather its durability and longevity, transforming it from fragile, rotting flesh into a material strong enough for armour, or delicate enough for bookbindings. And in the medieval period, this meant using one of the oldest organic compounds available, tannin, drawn from tree bark, particularly oak. In one corner of the tannery, piles of oak bark are ground into powder or soaked in water to release the precious tannins. The hides, still heavy and damp from their bath in lime and dung, are then lowered into large wooden vats filled with this tannin-rich solution, and they will remain there for days, or even weeks. Each day the tanner stirs the solution slowly with a wooden paddle. Not too fast, not too rough. Leather is strong, but hides are fragile in this intermediate stage. Over time, the tannins seep deep into the fibres of the hide, binding with the collagen and preventing future decay. This step, although far less vile than the earlier ones, demands just as much care. If the tannin concentration is wrong, or the timing mistimed, the leather may become too brittle or discoloured, rendering it useless. And so our tanner waits. He tends the vats like a gardener watching over his crops. He monitors the scent, the texture, the colour. He rotates the hides. He drains and refills the liquid. He listens. For even here, among bark and water, nature has its voice. Eventually, after much patience, the leather is ready. But there is still more to do. The hides are removed from the tanning vats and hung to dry slowly in shaded areas. Never directly in the sun, harsh light could crack and warp the finished product. The drying process can take many more days, and throughout, The tanner must be vigilant against mould, flies, and weather. Once dried, the leather must be softened, sometimes by hand, sometimes using tools. The process requires the tanner to stretch, knead, and fold the material repeatedly until it reaches the desired suppleness. Depending on the leather's final use, armour, boots, belts, or parchment, it might be dyed, treated with oils, or polished using stones or fat. This part of the process is quieter, more meditative. The sharp edge of danger has passed, but the tedium remains. A mistake here will not make the tanner ill, but it could cost him weeks of work. In a world where every hide is precious, every cut and crease matters. But what of the toll this took on the human body? The tanner's hands were perpetually dry, cracked, and sore. His skin absorbed toxins from the urine and lime. Many developed respiratory problems from inhaling dust and ammonia. The smell, of course, never left. It became a part of them. They could be identified not by their tools or their words, but by their scent, a pungent signature of their livelihood, and that, more than anything, cast them apart from society. Most tanners were not wealthy, nor were they respected. They lived and died near their pits. Sons inherited their father's trades, and few outside the profession willingly married into it. In some towns, tanners were banned from public events, or forced to live downwind from the population centre. They were needed, but never wanted. And yet, tanners were indispensable. Without them, knights lacked armour, monks lacked bound books, farmers lacked boots, merchants lacked saddles. Leather was everywhere in medieval life, and it bore the invisible signature of the tanner, the man who toiled in rot, dung and darkness to give the world something it desperately needed. So the next time you picture a medieval knight galloping across a battlefield in shining steel, remember the tanner who prepared the leather straps binding that armour to his limbs. When you imagine a scholar opening a sacred text, remember the tanner who scraped and tanned the parchment's very pages. In this grim, unclean profession, there was a kind of nobility, not in glory, but in function. Now the day winds down. The hides are hanging, creaking softly in the breeze like sails in a harbour. The vats are still. The tanner wipes his hands on a rag and stares into the horizon. Tomorrow he will start again. Fresh hides, fresh lime, fresh dung. But tonight, in the stillness, he rests. Let the sound of drying leather and distant river water carry you off, slow and steady. Another hard day's work is done, and the tannery falls quiet once more. Let us now step into the great kitchens of a medieval castle. Not the grand halls or the richly decorated chambers, but the heart of heat and hunger. The place where fires burn all day and night, and where the unseen hands prepare feasts for nobles, knights, and visiting royalty. Within these kitchens, a hierarchy exists just as strict and unyielding as that of the court above. At the very bottom, often unnoticed, always exhausted, stands a young boy at a spit. Turning, turning, turning. He is called the Spit Boy. The name may sound humble, but the task is anything but. The Spit Boy's job was to rotate a large metal rod, skewering entire animals, pigs, deer, sheep or birds, over a roaring open flame. In a time before electricity, before motorised turners or temperature regulation, roasting was a manual art, and the Spit Boy was both tool and cook. Imagine the setting. A cavernous stone room, dark despite the firelight, with soot-stained ceilings and a constant hum of crackling wood and sizzling fat. The walls are lined with heavy iron pots and copper pans. Smoke lingers in the air, clinging to every breath. The temperature near the hearth can climb unbearably high, and there, just feet from the blaze, the Spit Boy stands. He is young, perhaps 7, maybe 10. Old enough to hold the spit, too young to complain. His hands are reddened, sometimes blistered from the heat. His job is simple in description: turn the spit at a steady pace, ensuring even cooking of the animal above the fire, but in practice it is tedious and punishing. He cannot stop, he cannot slow. If the meat is unevenly cooked, the master cook will know, and the punishment for a burned or undercooked meal, intended for a baron or bishop, can be swift and harsh. The hours are long. A whole pig might take 5 or 6 hours to roast. A cow, longer. The boy cannot walk away, he cannot sit, he must turn and turn and turn. The rhythm becomes his only companion. Tick, tock, like a human clock in a room filled with flame and sweat. Behind him, other cooks rush about, chopping vegetables, grinding spices, boiling sauces. They barely notice the boy by the fire. He is just part of the kitchen's furniture, a necessary presence, replaceable. Often, these boys were orphans or the children of servants, given over to the kitchen to earn their keep. They received no education, no training, just orders and the occasional scrap of meat or bread, if they were lucky. The fire offers no mercy. Embers pop and crack unpredictably, sending sparks up the boy's sleeves or onto his feet. The fat from the meat drips down into the fire, causing flare-ups, sudden bursts of flame that sear the skin and burn away eyelashes. Burns were common, so were fainting spells from the heat and dehydration, and yet no one stopped the work. The feast must go on. In some kitchens, clever cooks invented spit dogs, small terrier-like animals trained to run in a wheel, turning the spit mechanically. But these were rare luxuries, found only in the wealthiest of households. For everyone else, the task fell to boys, quiet, invisible, and expected to endure. There was also no guarantee of advancement. While other kitchen roles, like the scullion or assistant cook, might eventually move up the ladder, the spit boy had no real path forward. He was often too uneducated to read recipes, too poor to be trained in culinary arts. He existed in the background, and many stayed there, aging into obscurity. But sometimes, a lucky one caught the eye of a sympathetic cook or a noble patron. Maybe he showed unusual endurance, or cleverness in managing the fire. Maybe he survived long enough without injury. These few might be promoted to help prepare sauces or manage meats. But for most, the spit was both beginning and end. As the fire crackles and the meat turns, we hear only the steady grind of metal on metal, the quiet whimper of a tired boy too proud to cry. His arms ache, his eyes sting, yet he does not stop. Around him, the kitchen pulses with life. Above, the nobles laugh and toast, and here, below, the boy turns the feast, one rotation at a time. It is hard to imagine a more thankless job, and yet it was essential. Without the spit boy, the feast would fail. The nobles would go hungry, the castle would lose its rhythm. Even in the shadows of the medieval world, someone had to feed the fire, and so he does. As the morning sun barely filters into the kitchen through slits in the stone wall, the spit boy's day is only just beginning. The fire never truly goes out here. While others in the castle rest in soft beds under woolen blankets, the spit boy wakes stiff and sore, curled on a straw mat in some corner of the scullery. Before dawn, he is pulled from sleep by the gruff voice of the cook or the clanging of pots. Another day, another fire. There is a rhythm to this life, though it offers little comfort. First, the fire must be rekindled. The embers from the night before are coaxed to life with bellows and kindling. The boy's hands are already black with soot before breakfast, if he gets one. A crust of bread, perhaps, or a spoon of porridge if someone remembers him. But usually hunger walks beside him all day, an old and constant companion. Before long, the animal is brought in. A pig today, already slaughtered and cleaned, but heavy. He watches the cooks thread the carcass onto the spit with a practiced efficiency. Then the spit is hoisted onto its rack above the flame, and the turning begins. Slowly at first, there is no rush. The heat will rise, the fat will melt. The boy knows every crack of that fire, every sizzle of skin splitting under the heat. Roasting is not simple, it is a delicate act. The boy must turn the spit evenly, regularly. Too fast and the meat cooks unevenly, the skin tough. Too slow and it burns on one side, leaving the other raw. The cook might shout if he gets it wrong. A noble might throw his trencher to the floor. A meal ruined could bring real consequences. Food in this world is not just sustenance, it is politics, power, pride. As the fire grows hotter, the kitchen fills with heat and motion. Other servants rush about, but the spit boy cannot move. He's anchored to his post. He watches them come and go, sweat pouring down his back, eyes stinging. Smoke curls around him. Grease pops and flares. If he closes his eyes for even a moment, the flames might jump too high. He must stay alert. Even exhaustion cannot excuse failure. In time, he will be rotated, perhaps given a short break to fetch water or clean ashes. But he is never truly free from the fire. Even his breaks are spent near it, waiting to return. His muscles grow used to the same motion: pull, push, turn, repeat. Sometimes, late in the day when the heat is high and the room is noisy, he turns the spit without even thinking. His arms move as if possessed. He dreams of turning even when he sleeps. The dangers are not small, burns are constant. The fire might spit embers or sudden grease flare-ups. Some spit boys bore the scars their whole lives, marks of heat and toil across their arms and legs, and if he drops the spit or lets it fall, the meat can tumble into the fire and be ruined. The punishment for such an error might be severe: a blow, a beating, or just a day without food. For the poor, this job is better than starvation, but not by much. Still, there are rare moments of kindness. An older cook might hand him a bit of meat from the edge of the roast. A scullery maid might bring him a cup of cool water. These are quiet, private mercies. No one speaks of them. In a world of order and obedience, compassion is something smuggled in secret. There are tales, half whispers passed from one boy to another, of spit boys who rose through the ranks, who became cooks, or left the kitchen to serve in the household. But they are more myth than truth. For most, the kitchen is a cycle. Turn the spit until you're too big, too slow, or too injured, then be replaced by another small boy. The castle never runs out of orphans. As night falls and the feast begins in the great hall above, the spit boy is still at his post. He hears the music, harps, pipes, laughter, and smells the food he will never taste. He can imagine the nobles biting into the meat he roasted, drinking wine, celebrating their victories and alliances. He is a part of that moment, and yet entirely absent from it. His work is invisible, unthanked. He is not remembered in the songs or stories. But without him, there would be no feast, no meat on the table, no glory in the hall. And so he turns the spit until the bones are picked clean, the coals burn low, and the kitchen quiets once again. His hands are black, his feet are swollen. He lies down on his straw mat, firelight flickering on the stone walls. Tomorrow he will do it all again. There is a silence to certain kinds of danger, a slow, creeping kind that doesn't announce itself with swords or screams, but with fumes, fatigue, and the quiet gnawing of breath turned shallow. The life of a lime burner in the medieval world was just such a danger. Hidden in smoke, masked in dust, wrapped in the steady rhythm of fire and stone, their world was made of elements that consumed slowly: heat, time, and human health. It all began with stone, limestone to be precise. Dug from quarries by rough hands and rudimentary tools, these pale, heavy rocks were carted over long distances, often by donkey or by back. The lime burner's day began well before sunrise, hauling stone to the kiln site, often located just outside town, where the thick smoke would not choke the markets or offend the noses of the gentry. These kilns stood like squat stone towers, crude and ancient, built to contain infernos. A lime burner worked at the edge of civilization, both physically and socially. Their place was between the forest and the field, in no man's land. The kiln was their companion, a giant, insatiable mouth into which stone was fed, and from which fire belched and roared. Once the limestone was loaded, the fire had to be lit, and it would burn for days. Inside, the temperature rose to over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, transforming stone into quicklime, a powdery, volatile substance used to make mortar for buildings, treat soil, or even dispose of bodies. The work was punishing. The kiln needed constant tending. Logs had to be split, stacked, and fed into the flame without pause. The burner could never stray far. If the fire cooled, the batch would be ruined, days of labour wasted. So the lime burner watched it day and night, sleeping in short bursts if at all, and always with one eye open to the flicker of flame. Then there was the smoke, a white chalky haze that drifted around the kiln like a ghost. It curled into lungs, settled into the eyes, coated skin and throat. Lime dust itself was worse. When quicklime touched moisture, like the inside of a mouth or a tear duct, it hissed and burned. Many lime burners suffered from chronic coughing, blindness, and scarring on their skin. Yet there were no gloves, no goggles, no masks. Only the cloth wrapped around their faces, damp with sweat and sometimes blood. For most, it wasn't even their own kiln. They worked under a master burner, often a man who had burned lime for decades and whose body showed it. Stooped, wheezing, covered in permanent grime, the master gave orders with few words. He didn't need many. The rhythm of the kiln was known by the body. The timing of the logs, the colour of the flame, the sound of stone shifting deep inside. Apprentices learned through watching, doing, and sometimes through injury. The pay was meagre, but the demand for lime was constant. Towns were growing. Cathedrals climbed toward the sky. Mortar was needed for castles, for roads, for walls. The lime burners' back-breaking labour was hidden in the bones of every medieval city. Their fires lit the way for kings and craftsmen alike, but few ever saw them. Occasionally villagers passed near the kiln and gave the workers a wide berth. The smell was foul, a mix of smoke, scorched stone and sweat. Superstition too hung around the lime burners' trade. People believed that lime could burn flesh to nothing, and they weren't wrong. Bodies dumped into a hot kiln would disappear in hours. Stories of criminals, witches, or unwanted heirs being lost to the lime were whispered in fear, and lime burners were sometimes accused of aiding in such dark acts. Whether they ever did or simply bore the rumours is unclear. Even food tasted of lime. Dust settled on bread and into stew. It clung to clothes, to hair, to the walls of the hut beside the kiln where the burners sometimes rested. Clothes were never truly clean, skin never truly uncoated. There was a dryness to life, a powdery film that layered over the senses, but amid this hard existence, there was a strange kind of dignity. Lime burners were craftsmen. Their work laid the foundation, literally, for churches, towers, and bridges that might last 1,000 years. The fire they fed shaped stone into something useful, something permanent. While others might swing swords or weigh coin, the lime burner understood the patience of transformation, the quiet mastery of earth and flame. Still, the price was high. Many did not live long in the trade, their lungs gave out, their bodies wore down. Some wandered into the forest and never returned, lost to illness or to madness stirred by the endless heat. And yet, every new town, every rising cathedral needed lime. And so, the kilns kept burning, always burning. As the kiln's fire crackled on, sometimes for 3 or 4 days without pause, the lime burner settled into a world shaped by patience and pain. This was not a life of quick movements or dramatic turns. Instead, it was a slow erosion, of stone, of time, of the body. And yet, there was a rhythm to it, one that could become almost meditative. When the flames danced just right, and the logs snapped in time with the heartbeat, the burner might forget, for a moment, the toll it was taking. The transformation inside the kiln was almost alchemical. Limestone turning into quicklime, solid rock yielding to white dust. From the outside, there was nothing beautiful about it. Just heaps of rubble, piles of timber, and men with soot-covered faces pacing like ghosts. But inside, the ancient process worked in silence, a kind of magic, powered by fire and endurance. Once the lime was finished, the real danger often began. The kiln, now cooled only slightly, had to be opened and the quicklime extracted. That powder, so vital to builders and masons, was highly caustic. When it met water, say the moisture in your lungs or the sweat on your skin, it reacted violently. A cloud of dust could blind a man in seconds, sear his throat or burn raw patches into his hands. There were stories, some true, some exaggerated, of lime burners whose eyes melted from their sockets, of lungs so scorched they collapsed from within. But the work had to go on. The lime had to be bagged, loaded onto carts, and sent to the towns where towers would rise and walls would be sealed. The product of this suffering, this flame-fed labour, was always moving forward. The man who made it stayed behind. No one glorified the lime burner. Their names were rarely recorded, and their deaths often passed without note. A young apprentice might simply vanish, buried in a small grave behind the kiln, or consumed by the fire itself in a moment of misstep. The master burner would say a few words perhaps, and then go back to stoking the flame. The kiln never waited for grief. Despite the hazard, it was work. Work in a world where most choices were cruel. In the villages, where famine and war were constant threats, a place at the kiln at least promised food, if not comfort. There was camaraderie too in suffering. The men who worked the kilns came to understand each other in quiet, in gestures. Words were few, but bonds were strong. A burned hand wrapped in cloth, a shared jug of water, a nod at dawn as the smoke rose anew. There were times when the lime burner might feel pride. As he walked through a town, he might pass a wall sealed with his lime, or a chapel roof held strong by mortar he helped make. He would not tell anyone, but deep inside something stirred, an echo of purpose maybe. His hands bore the pain of creation, and though no monument would carry his name, his labour held up those that did. The seasons changed, but the fire did not. In winter, the ground froze and made log hauling brutal. In summer, the kiln's heat mixed with the sun's and made men collapse where they stood. And still, the lime burner toiled. There were no holidays, no celebrations, only the long, slow burning of life in service of stone. And then one day the burner would stop. Whether from old age, injury, or the slow suffocation of time, his body would give out. A younger man, perhaps his son, perhaps just another boy with no other option, would take his place. This cycle would begin again. Fire, stone, dust. Hands cracked open by heat, skin soaked with sweat and ash. Even today, in the bones of ancient castles and the mortar between medieval bricks, you can still find traces of their work. Quiet fingerprints, invisible to most, but the lime remembers, the stone remembers, the fire remembers, and now so do we. As we drift into stillness, and the images of smoke and stone settle into the mind like the fine white dust of quicklime, we leave behind the silent, patient figure of the lime burner, standing beside his kiln, eyes squinting through the haze, one hand shielding his face from the fire that never sleeps. In the towering silhouettes of cathedrals and the stout frames of stone castles, we often forget the human effort embedded in every corner. Hidden beneath arches and behind scaffolding was one of the most punishing roles in medieval construction, the treadwheel operator. Their job was not remembered in records or preserved in stained glass, but without their silent, grueling labour, nothing of greatness could have been built. The treadwheel, often called the human hamster wheel, was exactly what it sounds like. Imagine a giant wooden drum, sometimes 10 feet across, suspended high above the construction site, attached to a primitive crane, and inside it, walking endlessly in circles, was a man. His feet pushed forward step after step, and with each motion ropes tightened, pulleys turned, and great blocks of stone were lifted into the sky. This was no honoured position. The treadwheel operator worked high in the air, exposed to wind, rain, and freezing temperatures. Sometimes they were barefoot. Often they were given no choice. The dizzying heights were so terrifying that many who took the job had to be blind. In fact, some construction sites would specifically hire blind men, not for charity, but because blindness removed the fear of falling. Think of that. A man walking in slow circles, unable to see how high he is or where his next step may land. All he knows is the groan of wood beneath his feet and the occasional jolt of motion as a load rises or lowers on the crane. The wheel creaks, the ropes tighten, the platform sways, and still he walks. There were no safety harnesses, no nets. A slip meant death. A misstep, a stumble, or a weak board could send him falling dozens of feet onto the hard ground below. Even if the operator survived a fall, broken bones often led to infection, and infection led to quiet, painful ends. But there were always more men desperate enough to step inside that wheel, willing to risk everything for a bit of coin and a bowl of stew. Work began before dawn. As fog clung to the rooftops and dew wet the stone, the operator would climb to the platform, guided sometimes by hand, sometimes by memory. He would step into the wheel and begin his shift. Hours passed slowly. Each movement felt the same. The rhythm became hypnotic. There was no rest, only a constant plodding pace that must be kept, lest the crane falter or the weight shift dangerously. Supervisors on the ground shouted instructions, but the operator could rarely hear them clearly. The wind stole voices. The creak of timber drowned out words. Sometimes hand signals had to be used. One wrong signal, and a block of stone could swing wildly or crash into scaffolding. Other workers were always at risk because of the operator's actions, and the pressure never lifted. In the cold months, the wheel became slippery with frost. In summer, it burned beneath bare feet, and if it rained, as it often did, the wood would swell and crackle, throwing the balance of the whole mechanism into question. Still, the treadwheel operator continued. Because he had to. Because in truth, this was still better than starving. These operators rarely spoke of their work. They didn't have the luxury of pride, and yet they could feel something quiet, when they looked up at the towers slowly rising above them, knowing that their steps, their very breath, helped bring those stones into place. Some worked alone, others shared the wheel with a second man. Those shared shifts were strangely intimate, marked by a deep silence, broken only by the tread of feet and the occasional grunt of fatigue. You couldn't talk. You had to conserve breath. Your hands gripped the side rails. Your body swayed in rhythm with the movement. You didn't look forward. You didn't look back. You just walked. They said the best operators could fall asleep while walking, so ingrained was the motion. One foot, then the other, over and over, an endless path that went nowhere but lifted everything. The work didn't make men rich. It didn't make them famous. It aged them quickly. Many operators didn't live to see the completion of the buildings they helped raise. Their part of the story disappeared once the scaffold came down and the stone towers stood tall. But for a little while the sky turned grey and the wind blew cold through the timber, they were a part of something enormous, not seen, not known, but essential. As the wheels turned, so too did the ambitions of kings, of bishops, of empires. And as the world drifted to sleep beneath candlelight and soft winds, the treadwheel creaked on, high above, slow and steady, powered by a forgotten man inside. As we return to the slow-turning wheel, high above the stone and dust of the medieval building site, we find the treadwheel operator still walking. He does not rush. He cannot rush. Every step must be deliberate, every movement carefully weighted. The success of the construction and the safety of the workers below relies on his steadiness, his calm presence, his quiet endurance. Inside the wheel, time loses meaning. An hour might pass like a minute, or a minute might feel like a whole day. There are no clocks in the sky, no sun to watch if the day is overcast. Just the creak of the wood and the occasional tug of the ropes, which tell him that a stone has reached its place, or that another is on its way up. Below him, masons chip and shape stone with rhythmic taps. Carpenters swing hammers, labourers shout and strain. But inside the wheel, all that fades into muffled noise. It becomes a background hum, like distant thunder. The operator can barely hear their voices. He's alone with his footsteps, and the great wooden drum that turns the world. If he looks out through the cracks in the planks, if he dares, he might catch a glimpse of the distant fields beyond the town walls, a patchwork of greens and browns, tiny figures moving like ants, or perhaps the churchyard still and silent. But most of the time, he does not look. Not because he's forbidden to, but because looking only reminds him of how high he is, how far he might fall. Many operators kept charms tucked into their tunics, a carved bone, a lucky coin, a scrap of cloth from a child's blanket. Tiny symbols of hope, not for wealth or fame, but for safety, for a quiet return home, for the strength to finish the day and keep walking when the limbs begin to tremble. These were not men seeking glory, they were simply men trying to get by. In the winter, when snow dusted the stones and frost glazed the wooden planks, walking inside the treadwheel became even more treacherous. The breath of the operator fogged before his face, his fingers numbed. Sometimes ice formed in the cracks of the wheel, making each step a gamble, and still he walked. Because he had to. Because no one else would. In some towns, people whispered that treadwheel operators age faster than other men. Perhaps it was the cold, or the fear, or the relentless monotony. Or maybe it was something deeper. the toll of being so close to danger every single day, and yet without them there would be no towers, no bridges, no fortresses. These men, so easily forgotten, were the living engines of progress. The work wasn't always constant. Sometimes the operator had to pause, waiting for a load to be secured or for a signal from below. But even in these moments of stillness, he could never rest. His muscles ached, his feet throbbed. He might lean against the inner rim of the wheel, trying to shift the weight off one leg. But there was no sitting, no real relief. And when the wheel moved again, it often jerked, suddenly and without warning. That first jolt could knock a man off balance. If his hands weren't ready, if his mind had wandered, he might stumble, and in that stumble, lose his life. Because if he fell and the wheel turned, his own momentum could trap him, or worse, drag him down between the slats and crush him. It was no small danger, it was a constant one. Sometimes at night, the operators would dream of walking. Not walking in fields or along rivers, but inside that same wooden wheel, step after step in a dream that never ended. They awoke sore, as if they'd walked all night. Perhaps they had in some way. That's the nature of this work. It seeps into your bones, and when, after years of walking, an operator could no longer climb the scaffold or carry the weight of the job, there were no pensions or retirement plans. He would be replaced quietly by someone younger, someone stronger, someone just as desperate. The city would keep building, the tower would grow, and the wheel would keep turning. But for a moment now and then, as the sun cut through the morning mist, and the bell tower cast a long shadow over the stone yard, someone might look up and see that wheel spinning slowly against the sky, and remember that it was not machines, not magic, but men who made the medieval world rise. And high inside that creaking circle, still walking, still steady, was the treadwheel operator, unseen, unknown, but essential. In the quiet corners of medieval towns, where shadows clung to alleyways and whispers travelled faster than wind, there lived a man that many spoke of, but few dared approach. He did not wear the robes of a nobleman, nor the tools of a blacksmith. His trade was darker, colder, bound not by skill or craft, but by a strange mixture of fear, necessity, and isolation. He was the executioner. To be an executioner in the Middle Ages was not a role one sought after. It was, more often than not, inherited, or forced, passed from father to son, handed down like a curse. Once a man had taken a life by sentence of the court, his name was never quite clean again. Even if he had done so by law, even if he had done nothing wrong, the stain of death clung to him like soot, and no amount of washing could remove it. And so, the executioner lived a life half in and half out of society, needed by all, welcomed by none. In many towns, the executioner's house was placed beyond the main square, sometimes outside the city walls. He was not invited to weddings, he was not greeted in the market. Children crossed the street when they saw him coming. Even priests, in some cases, refused to take his confession. For who hears the sins of the man who carries out the law's most final command? And yet, without him, the justice system could not function. Every execution required careful preparation. It was not just a matter of swinging an axe or tying a rope. It was a ritual, a performance, an expectation. The crowd wanted to see justice done, but they also wanted a spectacle. They arrived early, pressing in close to the wooden scaffold. Some brought children, some cheered, others prayed. And in the centre of it all stood the executioner, silent, focused, grim. If the sentence was beheading, he had to ensure the blade was sharp. A dull axe would mean suffering. Multiple blows. A messy, drawn-out end. That was not only cruel, it was dangerous for the executioner himself. A botched execution could turn a crowd from curious to furious. Stones could be thrown. Riots could break out. The people's wrath, once ignited, was unpredictable. The executioner had to remain calm, steady, detached. But he was still human. He saw their faces, young, old, trembling, defiant. He heard the last words, the sobs, the curses. He watched the light leave their eyes, and then, once the act was done, he stepped back, quietly, as the crowd shouted or fell silent, and the world moved on. Some executioners tried to distance themselves from the act. They drank. They prayed. They told themselves they were merely tools of justice. But others took pride in their skill. They practiced, they trained, they spoke of clean cuts, of single swings, of merciful ends. A perfect execution was a strange kind of art, one that no one applauded but all demanded. And the job did not end at executions. Executioners were often called upon for other grim duties. Torture, for example, was sometimes part of an interrogation or punishment. Stretching, breaking, burning, all were part of a broader system of fear and control. The executioner was expected to carry these out without hesitation, to do what others could not, to obey orders without question. Some were also tasked with disposing of bodies, both human and animal. Knacker's work, they called it. Dragging corpses, burying the dead, cleaning up the mess that others left behind. It was dirty, thankless work, but it kept them fed, and that was the strange thing about the executioner. He was both reviled and relied upon. He existed in a strange middle space, both powerful and powerless. He held the sword, yes, but he had no voice in the court. He delivered justice, but had no say in its meaning. He stood above others on the scaffold, yet lived below them in daily life. It was a lonely path, and perhaps that is what makes the executioner one of the most tragic figures of medieval society. Not just because of what he did, but because of how the world saw him. Not as a man, but as a function. Not as a person, but as a shadow. A necessary evil in a world obsessed with order and punishment. As the sun set behind the gallows and the town square slowly emptied, the executioner remained behind. He packed away his tools. He wiped the blade clean. He stepped down from the platform and disappeared into the narrow alleys, back to his solitude, back to the quiet. Until the next name was called, until the next sentence was passed, and the cycle continued. In the second part of our quiet journey into the life of the medieval executioner, we look not just at the duties he performed, but at the hidden world he lived in, the traditions, taboos, and strange moments of humanity that flickered, even in the shadow of the gallows. Most people assume that an executioner lived only in violence, but in truth, his life was more routine than dramatic. He kept his tools in a locked chest, each one with its purpose. The axe, of course, was most iconic, but there were others. The sword of justice, used for nobility. A rope for hangings, carefully tied with practiced knots. The branding irons, the wheel, the stakes. The executioner was a craftsman in a grim sense. Precise, prepared, deliberate. His day might begin not with an execution, but with a summons. A rider from the magistrate. A note nailed to his door. A whisper from a town official letting him know. Tomorrow there will be a sentence to carry out. He would then prepare, not just the tools, but the scaffold, the ropes, the space. He would inspect the site for safety, set boundaries for the crowd. Some executioners even wore uniforms or black hoods, though this was not as common as myths suggest. In some cities he kept a book, a ledger of the condemned, names, dates, crimes, methods, a quiet record of justice done, or justice attempted. But what was it like to live between those moments? Well, the executioner's isolation shaped every corner of his life. Marrying was difficult. Even if he had wealth, and some did, many families would not let their daughters wed such a man. In some cases, executioners could only marry within their own small caste of unclean professions, grave diggers, knackers, or other executioners' families. They lived apart from townsfolk, sometimes in dedicated houses near the gallows or cemeteries, separate, marked, known. There are stories of executioners who went years without ever being touched by another person in kindness, who were served food by innkeepers who used tongs or boards to pass the dish. Even when they did good, catching a thief, helping during a fire, they remained outcasts. The punishment they administered extended to themselves in 1,000 quiet ways. Still, some found ways to hold on to pieces of humanity. They played instruments in secret, wrote letters they never sent, tended gardens where no one came. A few even took apprentices, not out of pride, but out of necessity. The work had to be passed on, and it was better to train someone properly than to leave it to chance. An untrained hand could turn justice into cruelty. Interestingly, not all executioners were hated. In some towns, especially in larger cities like Paris or Nuremberg, executioners gained strange respect. They were feared, yes, but also paid well. Protected. They had contracts. Some received housing from the crown. A few were even consulted as surgeons, since their knowledge of anatomy was unmatched. Others became unofficial healers, applying herbal remedies or setting bones, because they understood the human body in ways few did, and still they remained apart. The most haunting part of the executioner's life wasn't the act of killing, it was the waiting. The long nights after a public death, the silence in his home, the sounds of the town going on without him, laughter he was not invited to, church bells that did not ring for him, and above all the dreams, if he dared to sleep. Some wrote that they heard voices, some saw faces, some simply stared at the ceiling, hour after hour waiting for the night to pass. It's said that a few executioners tried to leave the profession, to run, to start over in another town. But the past followed. People found out. The stigma stuck. And most of them, in the end, returned. Better to be a marked man with a role than a wandering one with none. One curious detail. Executioners were sometimes required to clean the site after death. Not just remove the body, but wash the blood, dismantle the gallows, and sometimes burn the clothes of the deceased, a kind of ritual cleansing. They were both the agents of death and the caretakers of its aftermath. And so, the executioner's legacy lingers. Not in monuments or songs, but in the quiet corners of old books, in the margins of legal records, in the tools found buried beneath old city squares. We remember kings and generals, yes, but the executioner, he was the hand that enforced their will. The final chapter of many lives, the silent figure behind the curtain of justice. As we close this part of our journey, imagine the executioner not just as a man with an axe, but as a reflection of the world he served, a symbol of fear, duty, and isolation, a lonely figure on the edge of law and humanity. And when the sun rose again, he would wake, clean his blade, fold his hood, and wait for the next name. In the dim silence of the early morning, before the market stalls were opened, and before the bells rang through cobbled town streets, there was another kind of work beginning, quiet, solemn, and utterly necessary. The work of the body collector. It was a job few spoke of with anything but discomfort, and one that no one envied. Yet in times of great illness and death, especially during the plagues of medieval Europe, it was among the most vital. The Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-13th centuries, left behind more than just fear and sorrow. It left cities paralysed by the sheer number of the dead. At the height of the pandemic, entire neighbourhoods were silenced overnight. No one could keep up with proper burials. Priests were overwhelmed, gravediggers fell ill, families vanished. And so, out of necessity, the role of the body collector emerged. A grim but essential figure who walked the streets, cart in hand, removing the remains of plague victims from homes, doorsteps, and alleyways. These collectors were often poor men, sometimes criminals, sometimes desperate townsfolk, who had little choice but to accept the job. It paid. Not well, but enough to eat, and during the plague survival was more precious than gold. Sometimes they were press-ganged into the role, other times they volunteered if they had no family left to protect or mourn. It was a job given to the expendable. Their work began at dawn. Clothed in whatever rags or coverings they could find, they might wear long coats soaked in vinegar or wrapped in waxed fabric. Anything they believed might shield them from disease. Later in the plague years, some wore masks stuffed with herbs and flowers, the earliest versions of what we now imagine as the beaked plague doctor mask. Though that mask is more associated with physicians, some body collectors adopted similar strategies, hoping the strong scents would ward off infection. In one hand, the body collector often carried a stick, sometimes to prod corpses, sometimes to push back stray dogs, or to open doors without touching them. In the other, a bell. This bell was not for decoration, but for warning. "Bring out your dead," some would cry in monotone, barely audible under layers of cloth. The bell became a dreadful sound. When heard, it meant death had arrived nearby. Again. The carts they used were crude and wooden, with splintered edges and creaking wheels, As the collectors walked the city, people would emerge cautiously from homes, faces covered, dragging out wrapped bundles of cloth. Sometimes the bodies inside were limp and obviously dead. Other times they twitched, caught between sickness and passing, and the line between mercy and cruelty blurred. Children, old men, entire families. The cart filled quickly. Occasionally there were too many dead to remove in one round. The body collector would make mental notes, this house, the third one down, the alley behind the bakery, and return later. But by then others may have joined the pile. Disease moved quickly, so did decay. Most disturbing of all, perhaps, was how routine it became. The collector did not weep. He could not. There were too many faces, too many names forgotten as soon as they were uttered. In time, he might stop asking, stop listening. The weight of it all, not just the bodies, but the silence, the sorrow, the stench, settled into the bones. Yet there was a rhythm to it, a slow, plodding, repetitive motion. Walking, loading, walking, burying. It was exhausting, but in a strange way, meditative. Each day mirrored the one before, and in that sameness, there was something like peace, detached, grim peace. Disposal of the dead varied depending on the time and place. Sometimes the collectors brought the bodies to mass graves, long trenches dug hurriedly outside city walls. There, the corpses were tipped in, layer by layer, dusted with lime and covered. Sometimes, if space ran out, the dead were burned. In smaller villages, the collector might be the one to dig the grave himself. And in truly desperate cases, the bodies were left stacked, waiting for a digger who might never come. Still, some collectors took small care. They crossed arms, mumbled blessings, placed a flower, a tiny act of dignity amid the horror. We don't know many of their names. They weren't written into the grand stories of the time. They didn't sit beside kings or scribes. But without them, entire cities would have collapsed into disease and rot. They were the caretakers of a dying world, men who waded into despair so others wouldn't have to. And as the bell rang again, they walked on, one step at a time, toward the next house, the next burden, the next name lost to history. And so, we come to the end of our long, quiet walk through the darker corners of medieval life. A time when danger didn't just come from war or rebellion, but from the very jobs that people performed each and every day. From trudging into icy waters to collect bloodthirsty leeches, to turning spits for hours near roaring fires, to silently pulling the dead from shuttered homes. These were the lives quietly lived beneath the noise of kings and castles. As you rest now, maybe you'll carry with you a small thread of gratitude for the ordinary safety of your world. No leeches to tend, no plague carts to fill, just the soft rustle of your blanket, the low hum of the present, and the quiet knowledge that you're far away from the grind and grit of those centuries past. History isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's just hard. But in that hardship, we find the texture of real life, grimy, strange, and often silent. And in that silence we can drift. Let your eyes grow heavier now. Let the world of clanking armour and creaking carts dissolve. Nothing needs your attention anymore. You've heard their stories. You've walked their roads. And now, it's time to return to yours, slowly, softly, gently. Thank you for spending this time here. Sleep well, dream kindly, and we'll meet again in another quiet story. Good night.